He had been raised in Indonesia. He was also anti-colonial. He was raised in Indonesia when the country was fighting for freedom from the Dutch. And their family home had been burned by the Dutch. But nevertheless, Anne marries this guy Lolo, and she takes young Barack Obama, and they move to Indonesia, where they live for 4 years. But then something rather amazing happens, and that is this Lolo guy who starts off as being anti-Western, anti-American, slowly becomes more pro-Western, more anti-communist, and more pro-American. He goes to work for an oil company. He moves kind of into a white neighborhood with a lot of Europeans and Americans. And he begins to say nice things about America. And Anne turns on him and begins to attack him. And she says, "You're a traitor. You're a sellout." And she turns to young Obama and says, "Listen, don't be like this guy. You should grow up to be like your real dad. He was a real man. He was uncompromising. He stood for principles." And she packs up young Obama, age 10, and sends him back to America. Does she go with him? No. He goes alone. And Anne Obama spends the rest of her life based in Indonesia, never returning to America to live. She comes back to visit until she gets cancer at a late age and comes back to America to die. Now, this is the bizarre life of Barack Obama. In fact, Obama on the campaign trail would often say, "I'm raised by a single mother," but the sad truth is that he was actually raised by neither his mother nor his father. He was kind of abandoned by both. And he was always in a search for identity. And when he got to Columbia University in the early 1980s, his sister, a woman named Auma, comes to visit him. And she actually wakes him up. She says, "Obama, you got to stop this nonsense. What's all this idolizing of our father? He wasn't such a great guy." And she tells him the truth about Barack Obama Sr. And Obama is stunned. He can't believe it. In fact, the quote from his book, he says stuff like this. He goes, "The sky turned yellow, animals began to talk, everything was upside down. His poor world is discombobulated because he can't figure out his image of the dad has been shattered by what his sister tells him." And Obama resolves then and there, "I've got to go myself to Africa and figure it out." And he does. A few years later, Obama takes off a summer. He spends 3 weeks in Europe, and then he spends a month in Africa. In his book, by the way, his 3-week trip in Europe is described in exactly 2 paragraphs. And his 1 month in Africa is then described in the subsequent 131 pages. That's when Obama becomes himself. He goes to Africa, and there's a culminating scene in which he goes to his father's grave. And he weeps. And Obama says, "I flung myself on the ground," and I quote him now, he says, quote, "Through Africa's red soil, I spoke to my father." And this is in 1988, and it's a little bit odd because his dad's been dead for 6 years. And yet here's poor Obama, and he's trying literally to get his father out of the ground. But he can't. He isn't there. So Obama has a really interesting choice. He can accept the father, he can reject the father, he's got to figure out what to do. And what he actually does is very creative, and in a way very interesting. He sort of splits the father into 2. And here's what I mean. Obama decides then and there, I can't have my father, but I'll take his dream. In other words, I'm not going to be like my father in personality. He was not a very good dad. I will be. He was not a family man. I will be. I'm not going to be like him as a person, but even though he was a flawed man, he had great and noble ideals. Those are his dreams. I'm going to take those dreams, and where he failed, I will succeed. That is the meaning, in fact, it is the only meaning, of Dreams from My Father. So, what was Barack Obama Sr.'s dream? Well, Barack Obama Sr., as I mentioned a moment ago, a little earlier, was an anti-colonialist. And what is anti-colonialism? Well, for us in America, it's a bit of a weird idea. But for me, growing up in India, it's a very familiar idea. Why? Because India was a colony of the British, same as Kenya. Who was an anti-colonialist? My dad, my grandfather, my uncles, kind of everybody I knew. And anti-colonialism, I have to tell you, is the predominant ideology in Asia and Africa and South America and the Middle East in the past 100 years. It is the main source for anti-Americanism in the world today. If you want to know where anti-Americanism comes from, some people say, well, it comes from Islam. Well, even if it did, that would only explain anti-Americanism in the Middle East or in the Muslim countries. But what about everywhere else? The anti-colonial explanation is much bigger, much stronger. So what's anti-colonialism? It's actually very simple. The whole world is divided into two. There are the colonizers, and that's the West, the white man, the oppressor, and on the other side you have the colonized, and those are the poor people of Asia, Africa, South America. These are the colonized, the victims. And the basic idea is that the rich countries became rich. How? By invading and occupying and looting the poor countries. And that within the rich countries you have powerful institutions, economic institutions, the banks, the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the oil companies, and cultural institutions, like the church, which was once the handmaiden of colonialism, the missionaries going out with the conquerors to other countries. So you have these powerful institutions in the West that in a way are still upholding colonialism, still doing oppression. Oppressing who? Oppressing people, not just poor people in their country, but also around the world. And the final idea of anti-colonialism is that the baton of leadership has passed from Europe to America. So who used to be doing all the invading and the looting? The British, the French, the Dutch. But now, that has passed to the United States. We, America, we are the rogue elephant that's stampeding around the world, invading small countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, looting them, stealing their oil, and so on. The rogue nation of the world is not Iran, it's not North Korea, it's us. We're the bad guy. And what's the anti-colonial solution? The anti-colonial solution is really simple. Number one, put a leash on the rogue elephant that is America. Stop it. Pull it back. And number two, mobilize against these neo-colonial institutions, these economic institutions that are oppressing people financially and in some ways culturally, religiously. You got to fight against all those guys using the power of the state. Incidentally, in 1965, Barack Obama Sr. wrote an article in the East Africa Journal, and the article explored a simple question, which is, what do you do in a country where you've got powerful economic interests at the top that control most of the wealth? What do you do about those guys? That's the question he was addressing. And Obama said, what you have to do is you have to get the power of the state and go find those guys and take their stuff. Confiscate their wealth. Take their land, take their property, and you need, he said, very high tax rates to do it. How high? Now I quote him, tax rates of, quote, up to 100%. 100% taxation. Now, ordinarily, you might think this is like nuts, right? What sane guy would recommend 100% taxation? But interestingly, who would work if you had to pay 100% taxes? But if you plug in the anti-colonial assumption, I submit to you that this idea actually makes total sense. Why? Because the anti-colonial assumption is that wealth is created not by work or effort, but through theft. People get rich by ripping off other people. And so, if you came to my house and took all my furniture, what's the proper tax rate for you? 100%. Why? Because it's not your furniture. So, what we have here is the notion that state power can be mobilized against not just income, but against wealth. because wealth has been accumulated through piracy. Now, what's interesting, by the way, is up to this point, I've not said one word about Barack Obama, the president. I've actually been talking about the beliefs of his father. And the question I want to ask is, how do we know that the beliefs of the father have been taken to heart by the son? How do we know that they're actually guiding what Obama is doing in the White House? There's only one way to know. I mean, we have Obama's autobiography, which says he's influenced by his dad, but how do we know his actions are shaped by the dad? There's only one way to know, and that is you have to match the ideology of the father with the actions of the son. You have to see if the jigsaw fits. So let's do that for just a moment. We look at Obama. There are a couple of puzzlements about Obama that are odd at the outset. I'll give you a small example. One of Obama's first actions when he came into the Oval Office was, it was the bust of Winston Churchill in the Oval Office. Obama said, I want it removed. Now, that by itself is not that odd. Actually, the president gets to decorate his own office. But Obama wanted to return the bust to England. And the Brits were a little unnerved by that. They were like, you know, we're like Israel. We thought we had kind of a special relationship with you guys. Okay, you don't want the bust in the Oval Office? All right, well, you know, put it in Biden's office. Lots of other places to relocate it. But Obama was no. He was weirdly insistent that the bust go back to Britain. So, shamefacedly, the British took it back. It's now sitting in the home of the British ambassador in Washington, D.C. So it's actually technically off American soil. To this day, no person, liberal or conservative, has given any explanation, any believable explanation, for why Obama would do this. We all think of Churchill as a bipartisan hero. We shall fight them on the beaches, opposing the Nazis. But not me. When I grew up in India, in high school, we learned about the Churchill who met Gandhi and said, I will not be the prime minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. Churchill was the colonial secretary for Britain. He rode with Lord Kitchener at Omdurman, the battle in the Sudan. In the 1950s, he was actually re-elected. And there was an anti-colonial guerrilla uprising in Kenya called the Mau Mau uprising. Churchill sent in troops and crushed it. And among the people arrested were one Onyango Obama, the president's grandfather, who was put in a detention camp for 6 months, and one Barack Obama Sr., the president's dad. So the point I'm trying to make is, Barack Obama has very good reasons to hate Winston Churchill. Now, this is what I call the test of a good theory. The test of a good theory is that when you put the theory in, the facts are completely explained. And you remove the theory, and you can't explain them at all. Here's another example, Jeremiah Wright. To this day, there's no good explanation for why Obama would, A, sit in that church for 20 years, B, baptize his kids there. After being married there, they were his largest charity. He names his only other book. Obama's only written 2 books, and they're both about himself. But the second book is named after a sermon given by Jeremiah Wright. So he was very close to this guy. Why? At the first glance, it's puzzling, right? Here's Jeremiah Wright, God damn America, the government is putting AIDS in the black community. That's not Obama. So what's going on here? Here's the liberal explanation. Obama did belong to that church, but he wasn't really listening. He was kind of a 20-year church dozer, if you will. Not so plausible, but the conservative explanation doesn't really work either. You can't just say Obama agreed with everything that Jeremiah Wright says, because Jeremiah Wright's stuff doesn't sound like Obama. Obama doesn't think the government's distributing AIDS in the black community. No. So what's going on here? All right. Obama says, so Obama, by the way, you know, what's kind of funny to me is people keep saying, you know, they keep asking me, is Obama a Muslim? I was recently on a radio show, someone said, is Obama a Muslim? And I was so tired of hearing the question, I said, you know what? I think he'd be a better guy if he was. The truth of the matter is, Obama was raised, and he says this himself, without religion. he was raised as an atheist. His father was an atheist, his mother was an atheist, and his stepfather was also an atheist, so it's not that big of a surprise. Obama worked in Chicago as a community organizer for a church group, and he kept working with pastors and priests, and everybody would ask him, "Hey Obama, where do you go to church?" Obama doesn't go, so he'd hem and haw. So finally one of his buddies, one of his Alinsky pals, says to him, "Obama, no one cares if you don't go to church, but you have to look like you go. You have to pretend to go. Go find a church." And he recommends this Trinity Church in Chicago. So Obama goes. He goes outside the church and he says, "In the lawn I saw a big sign, Free South Africa." Obama has just come back, by the way, from Kenya. And he goes, "Wow, here is the international theme that I care about." He goes in the church, there's an African man in a dashiki, speaking not just about civil rights, but speaking about what's happening in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and in Nicaragua, and in Sharpeville, South Africa. In other words, here's a guy who's actually invoking the great theme of Obama's life, which is, how did the world get to be this way? And Jeremiah writes, diagnosis is really simple. The reason the world is this way, the reason some countries are on top and other countries are at the bottom, is that the oppressors are taking advantage of the oppressed, and the greatest oppressor of all is the United States. That's the meaning of goddamn America. We are the bad guys. Obama understands that message perfectly.